Alright everybody, welcome in. My name is Joe. Today we're going to play some chess. So I had an opportunity to play this game, and it turned out to be a great example of some of the things we've been talking about recently. Specifically how to start playing chess. You sit down in front of a board, you're presented with the white pieces, and we've talked about opening up with this kind of pattern of the pawn, then the knight, then bring the bishop out. So we sat down at a board of chess, I had the white pieces, and that's exactly what I did. So I led off with the king's pawn, and my opponent responded, and we've talked about how this pattern that we use, you can play it almost against any opening, but as beginners we're going to face a lot of these expected responses. Anyway, I played knight f3, my opponent predictably played knight c6, and then I decided to go into an Italian game. From here, if you're playing with the black pieces, I recommend developing the bishop. If you go into what's known as the Giuoco piano, I recommend playing the Giuoco piano. You mirror the opponent's bishop, and you basically keep the board very balanced, right? There is another opening I've talked about, developing the bishop here into the Hungarian. It has its own pros and cons, but basically we're developing the bishop. That's what I recommend from this position, and bishop to c5 is the most common response. If we look at the database, bishop to c5, there's millions of games from that position. The second most common is actually knight f6, the two knights response. My opponent played a position, or a move that I did not expect, that I don't have experience with. Knight to d4 is the Schilling caustic gambit. I've never seen that. I don't know what that is. Excuse me. So from here, I have to go back and rely on my chess principles, right? The opening principles. Control the center, don't make too many pawn moves, don't bring your queen out too early, etc., etc. One of the things I'm looking at is, as a person seeing this opening for the first time, I have to kind of decide, what's the challenge, what's the threat? Well, my obvious response is, can I take? Well, if I take, my opponent takes back with a pawn, even trade, and I don't really see any advantage right now. Maybe my opponent can bring the queen out and put pressure. I don't know, but it seems like that's okay. And just looking at it on the surface, yeah, looks okay to me. What's the danger if I don't capture that knight, though? Do I accept the gambit or do I decline the gambit? What's the danger if I don't? Well, the danger is there is a fork possibility here. Now, that fork's going to need a little bit of help, obviously, because my queen is defending. But there is the possibility of a fork. All right, so we'll keep that in the back of our mind. That's a possibility. I don't like being knight forked. Knight forks kill me. So I decided in this particular game, I'm just going to go ahead and capture. My opponent captured back, and here we are in this particular position. From here, there's lots of things we can do. What is the most recommended move? If you're following along with some of the things that I've talked about, what do you recommend is my next move? Castle. Castling is the way to go here. Get your king to safety. Now, one of the other things I have talked about in the past is sometimes I like to delay castling if my opponent is nowhere near ready to castle. Specifically because I don't want to castle and then my opponent start an attack, opening up lines right in front of my king, where where this pawn could be a weakness. So I sometimes like to delay a little bit. And in this case, I look at, okay, if I'm going to delay castling, what's my next pieces to develop? Well, I don't want to bring my queen out too early, so I really want to get my knight and my bishop developed. Well, I can't develop my knight the way I normally would because that sneaky little pawn is right there. If I develop my knight this way, then I'm putting the knight on the edge, and the knights on the edge are dead, or knights on the rim are dim, but maybe I could remaneuver it somewhere, or something, I don't know. But I realized that I could push a pawn. Now, pushing this pawn opens up my bishop, and allows me to route my knight through this d2 square, and I can actually stick it over here back on f3 where my original knight was, which that original knight is a good defensive piece, that's why it lives there. And that actually comes with an attack on that pawn. Okay, so now I have a plan. Push the pawn, and I can get my pieces developed. So that's what I decided to do. I push a pawn. My opponent also does a similar pawn push, basically getting developed. But because this is such an awkward pawn push, and my opponent has pieces that could be developed, but he chooses to go this route, we are both rated about this time, about 1600, 1590s. So I'm assuming my opponent knows what they're doing at this point. This is obviously a line that they know. This is obviously something that they have played before. Why would they have gone into such a rare line if they don't know what they're doing? So my opponent plays this pawn, and I stop for a second, and I think, what's my opponent's plan? And I realize, my opponent can easily push the c5 pawn, defend. It's now supported. It opens up everything to be developed. They're going to be content, right? Why would they block in themselves? Well, this bishop can still get out. This pawn is going to develop here. And in fact, this bishop might even come this way. So these are the thoughts that are going through my mind. Why would my opponent push this pawn? Well, probably again, they're going to push the c pawn. So I continue with my plan. But now I'm thinking, if this knight comes here to b3, it'll put pressure on the central pawn and that c pawn when it comes eventually. Now, I've analyzed this game, and I probably should have continued with my knight move, but at the time, either way is fine. I didn't see anything wrong with it. My opponent continued to develop. I make my knight move. I feel like a genius, right? I'm totally prepared for my opponent's c-pawn push. And look, if the c-pawn push, I can now push my central pawn. If my opponent captures, nice. And I can even rotate my knight back around if I want. But yes, in this case, my opponent would have two central pawns to my one. My king is a little exposed, but I have now developed, and I've continued on with a pretty good plan, and I have disrupted a little bit of my opponent's strong center. At least that's what's going through my mind. My opponent chooses not to go that route, and instead goes for this fianchetto setup. Okay, that's fine. Now would be a great opportunity for me to castle. Absolute perfect opportunity for me to castle. Well, in my mind, I'm thinking, my opponent's got at least one more move to castle. I would like to get my bishop developed. That pawn, though, is just sitting there. I decide to pick up the pawn. It's a little greedy for me, probably a little early, but I do go up a pawn. So I'm up a full pawn at this point. I continue developing. My opponent continues developing. My opponent's ready to castle. I should castle. I am ready to castle. I should go for it. I start to get in my own brain a little bit, and I start to outthink myself. And I realize that my opponent could be setting up for a queenside castle. Now, what happens if I'm kingside castle to my opponent's queenside castle? It doesn't really mean anything, except that long term you can end up with a lot of conflict. My opponent is castled on this side of the board, so his safety net is here, and so everything on this side is he's just going to throw down the board. My king is over here defending. I'm going to throw everything I've got up the board that way. So you get this real active, a lot of fighting going on. I wanted to play solid principled chess. I wanted to try to keep balances where I could and make my opponent make mistakes. So I prepared to castle queenside just in case. My opponent castles kingside. At this point in time, 100%, the next move, I should castle. For some reason, I don't. I make a slow move, a very slow move that I should not have made. This move makes no sense in practice. If we look at this point in time, I have set myself up for a little bit of an advantage because I've got that free pawn, right? I picked up that pawn earlier. I'm in a pretty good position. I just castle here to finish my development. Done. Everybody's happy. I have an advantage. I make this slow move thinking that, well, I'm preventing my opponent's pieces from getting into a key square. But you can see the evaluation. The evaluation says that my opponent's position is now better than mine. by a little, right? Basically, I have given back the advantages that I've earned. So now we're moving into basically a middle game, and I'm not castled. My king's in the center of the board, so that was a dumb move on my part, where we can see the power of 1 tempo. I've already wasted tempo by running my knight 3 times. I'm now wasting another, and I wasted a tempo by moving developing my queen a little earlier than I had to. Now I'm wasting a 3rd tempo, and I'm just giving back my advantage. So my opponent immediately strikes in the center. My king is in the center. He's going to attack the center. Fine. So now here's where we're in a middle game, and I have to start playing smart. I see an undefended piece. I have to move my knight. I decide to go with an attack on the undefended piece. I'm secretly hoping my opponent will take back with the bishop so that I can, at the end of the day, have the bishop pair against opponent's mismatched pieces. In the long run, I'm hoping my bishop pair will become an advantage, but that's just kind of going through my mind. And in fact, my opponent does. Now here, we've talked about rule number 1 being just go play chess, right? Just go play games. You're going to lose a lot. That's okay. Go lose. Because by losing, we learn. And I have learned that this bishop can be trapped very easily. Because these pawns are already advanced in the center, because my bishop is here, if I were to retreat this way, this pawn comes down, pushes me back again. Normally this is not a problem because normally this c pawn is not pushed, right? This pawn, but it is pushed, which means this, in this particular game, I happen to have a pawn on d3. If this pawn was anywhere else on the board, if it was sitting back at home, or if I had pushed it to d4 earlier, this bishop would be completely trapped. So because we've played games and because we've lost, because we've blundered, and because we've had our own bishops get trapped, in the back of my mind, I know that's a possibility. And so I look at this route and I say, my bishop has an escape route. Yes, it could mean giving back the bishop pair. That's fine. But at least my bishop isn't getting trapped. I'm not throwing away pieces. I'm not blundering anything. That's fine. So that's the way I do. I decide to route that way, and sure enough, my opponent attacks. I have set up that square. My opponent can easily grab. We trade. It's a fine trade. I'm happy. Notice this did come with an attack on the rook, so my opponent develops. Last chance to be a genius, Joe. My opponent hasn't taken my bishop. I decide to pin that knight, so he can't take my bishop. I haven't castled yet, y'all. My king is still in the center. Lines are starting to open up in the middle of the board. I need to develop a danger sense, because this is a danger sense. I should have, my opponent's castled. I should be castled. I did not anticipate at all my opponent being as aggressive with his pawns as he was. Now, this whole move of my bishop has now come back to haunt me. And that alignment issue that I was so proud of, now it's gone. And now, indeed, my opponent can happily take my bishop, and he does. Okay, so we're still even in material. I have an extra pawn. There's a bit of an alignment issue that my opponent has. I can't take advantage of it yet, but I'm going to keep that in the back of my mind, and that will come into play later. I spot this advantage, this alignment issue. My opponent doesn't spot this alignment issue. What I do spot is this. So after all that's said and done, I'm prepared to drop a pawn. My opponent doesn't see it, thank goodness. But now we really have to defend, and we do. But you notice, us not castling has now come back to bite us. And this is where the game really turns. I went from a very but from a very solid position, very happy position with where I am, to right now I am not happy. I am cramped. I have to figure out a way to develop. So either I have to move my king. I cannot defend. Right, I can't defend. Everything is covered. So I have to move my king. Do I move it here underneath my queen? Or do I try to hide it back here, cramping my rook? Those are my choices. And I decided to go king here. King directly underneath my opponent's queen, but I do have that square covered. And that's one of the reasons I looked at it, is I have this square covered. My bishop is helping defend. My opponent's f-pawn is now in the way of his rook-queen alignment. So my king is a little bit safe here. I'm not happy. My rook is out of the game. My rook is dead. So essentially by doing this, my opponent I've dropped a whole rook. I'm still looking at this alignment in the back of my mind. My rook being dead, I know that the only way that my rook is going to get in this game is I have to open up this outside file. Early in the game, I didn't want to open it up because I thought I'd be castling. Well, since I never got around to castling, now it's time to open this up because I have to get my rook out. So I push this pawn with the idea that, well, my opponent's probably going to take. I can take back with the bishop with an alignment issue, or, you know what, I'll just take back with the rook. My bishop is defending that rook. My rook is now no longer trapped. I can reroute my rook around back into the game. I'm gonna be okay. That's what's going through my mind. My opponent closes down the board. Now my rook is never getting out. I am trapped. My opponent has the attack. Since my opponent's attacking, I wouldn't mind seeing the queens off the board. I would like to just hold this for a draw. That's where I'm thinking now. I've essentially made a couple of errors. The biggest one being that I didn't castle. I'm down essentially a full rook for a while. I've got to get rid of as many pieces of the board as possible so things can open up so that I can get this rook back into the game. Oh yeah, remember this alignment? That only works if this queen is out of the way. I go for a queen trade. This queen trade is going to help me in a million ways. Number one, gets the queens off the board. The main attacking piece my opponent has, well, one of the strongest attackers my opponent has, is eliminated. His attack is slowed down. My weak king, my weak rook, no longer not so weak, because capture, right, capture back, I now have a way to get back into this game. I'm going to have to work on a material advantage to overcome the positional disadvantage, but that's okay. We can make this work. So this is the position I'm looking at. My opponent decided something different. My opponent went for a concept that's known as, if you're going to trade, make it favorable to you. Trade on your terms. Well, what's one thing, if I look at this board position from black, what is black really, what's one of the black's really strong advantages right now? Black has full control of this open file real close to my king. Black probably wants to double up rooks. That would be a really strong tactic. Let's see, probably something like this maybe. And see, that square's covered, that one's covered, that's covered, that's covered. Yeah, so it looks like my opponent's probably gonna want to double up like that. Well, if they're gonna do that, and this is what I believe is going through my opponent's mind at this point in time, he decides to trade on his terms. He knows I want a queen trade. By trading on his terms, we're not opening up that outside file. This rook is not getting free. This rook is still dead. My opponent can double up his rooks, which increase, you know, as long as his rooks are connected. My rooks are never connected. So each of my individual rooks is less powerful than each of my opponent's rooks because his are connected. And he's going to have them connected on the only open file in the game. Those two rooks are going to be the strongest pieces in the game, hands down. I'm going to be cramped. and I'm gonna be crying, except for the fact that we spotted this alignment issue a long time ago. That queen trade, this is what happens in the game. What happened in the game, I went for the queen trade, my opponent took back, my opponent is ready to double up, my opponent missed this alignment issue. So getting the pawn is nice, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So getting that pawn is very nice. This alignment issue was never about the pawn though, it was always about the rook. And now this alignment issue means my opponent is dropping material. All of a sudden, I'm back in the game. That cramped position I was in, where I couldn't make any headway, where basically I was down a full rook, we're back in it. We have a distinct material advantage. We have 2 rooks and 8 pawns versus a rook, a bishop, and 6 pawns. So my opponent has dropped essentially 2 pawns and an exchange. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. I also have a plan to easily get my other rook into the game. So from here, I am content. I am happy. This is a winning position for me. All I have to do now is not be stupid, and I win this game. All right, moving on. So my opponent now, I know what my goal is. My goal is to get my rook out. My opponent attacks my weak pawn. I could perfectly fine and just let him have it. There is nothing stopping me from just letting him have it. It's not going to hurt me in the least. All right, maybe a little. But I could give back. I'm up material. I could give back some if it means an advantage. If it means that I can continue to get this stuff going. Let him have it, right? I develop, let him have it. I take control of the open file. That would be perfectly fine. And notice there's no more attack. My opponent's attack is completely shut down. He now has to basically work for it. I go on the offensive. Or we could do what happened in the game. Oops. I defend. And now defending on light squares, my opponent has a dark square bishop. I'm okay. And if my opponent takes, which he did, which they did, I still get to defend. And now one of my opponent's strengths going into the endgame is this formation, right? This strong pawn formation. Now my opponent has isolated pawns. Isolated pawns, and I have a rook. Well, those are targets. Plain and simple. Isolated pawns against a rook, those are targets, and I'm going to target them. My opponent targets my undefended pawn. I defend it. That bishop is now out of the game. Not out of the game. Not out of the game. But in my mind, as I'm playing this over the board, I have now turned a loss back into a win, because look at this isolated pawns. I'm content. I can move my king out of the way, and I can move my rook back into the game. Now from here, we're going to talk about end games. All right, end games are won and lost by recognizing where the imbalances are. I am going to have a hard time protecting the back end of this pawn chain. I wish it was easier, but my opponent has this bishop on this perfect diagonal. My rook can't come up to defend. My rook can't slide over to defend. And this rook is blocked in. So I have to get this other rook out, or I have to move this rook somewhere where I can defend, but I'm a little too slow. So my opponent slides over because, again, they can't get down here yet. So he's ready to move in to attack. I can't defend this A pawn. I can easily defend the B pawn, though. This B pawn, easily defended. I don't even have to do anything, and the B pawn's not going anywhere. It's on a light square. The only thing that can take it is the rook. If this pawn were to march down, that's fine. Trade off, I still have 2-1. So I'm fine defending the B pawn. I know that I'm going to have to give up the A pawn. I have triples. My opponent has triples. My weakness right now is this rook. The only way for me to really, really get into this game is to get my rook back involved. A rook versus a rook and a bishop is not good. But 2 rooks versus a rook and a bishop, that's good. So I continue with my plan. My opponent continues with their plan. I offer a rook trade. I know my opponent's not going to take it, and this is probably unnecessary. I know my opponent's not going to take it. They're going to go for this. Probably should have stuck my rook over here on e1. You know, maybe started harassing my opponent's king. But the idea here is I know my opponent's not going to take the rook trade. But I have a passed pawn. Let's not forget that this pawn here on d5 is a passed pawn. Let's march that baby. So my opponent goes for my outside pawn. That's fine. I start pushing my passed. My opponent is in time to stop it, but he stops it with the bishop. And now are you ready for the bonehead of the day? This is the move that completely mentally broke me. So in my mind, I'm a genius, right? Passed pawn. This bishop's job has to babysit the dark square, queening square. Has to. If the king starts moving in, that's fine. I just push. And then it's still defended, still defended, still defended. And if the king comes up, the king blocks the path of the bishop. I get a queen for free with check, defended. My opponent has to move. I get a queen. Well, in my mind, this bishop is out of the game. This bishop is now forced to babysit the queening square. And so I put a little check mark in it on my checklist, and I moved on. So now we have this. So this is what I'm looking at. I can slide a rook over, offer my opponent a rook trade. If he doesn't take the rook trade, which I don't think he will because he's down material, that means he's probably going to have to slide his rook somewhere. Probably to attack the base of my pawn chain. I slide my other rook over, giving my opponent access to this pawn. I now have 2 pawns here. One's defending the base of the pawn chain. This one's going to go up, pick up this pawn, and defend that pawn. I am a genius. Or I'm an idiot who completely blunders a full rook. Can't even take back. It's just a full rook gone. The only thing I can do at this point in time is push my pawn. Notice my opponent's king is now outside of the queening square. My opponent's king cannot enter the queening square. The bishop is in time, though, and this is what was played in the game. The bishop is in time. Queen, capture back. That's how I'm able to get the bishop back, at least. Now it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The material on the board is dead even. I went from, and if we look at the analysis, I want you guys to see this analysis real quick. From here, watch this analysis. We are at plus 10 and going up. Plus 10 is a guaranteed win. When the engines are at a plus or minus 10, that's when the engines resign, essentially. It's essentially over. Plus 10 is such a huge advantage that only an idiot like me can lose that. All right, so completely gone. Full advantage, disappeared, gone. We are back to basically a dead even endgame. White has a slight advantage, but so this is what I want to talk about here. So this is the endgame study. So now we're going to study this endgame, right? It's material-wise, it's dead even. Where are the imbalances? Well, you saw my next move. This pawn is fixed. This pawn is fixed. My rook can get between them and attack both at the same time. Yes, I am giving up my b pawn, which is defending. Yes, I know that. But my opponent goes in for the attack. I pick up a pawn. He picks up a pawn. Traded pawns. But I can pick up, and if my opponent goes here, I have plenty of time to get back to defend. I'm okay. Or, in this case, my opponent decided to attack my rook. Notice this square is defended. Attack. Pick up pawn number 2 while defending. White is now in a winning endgame position. 2 pawns up. Yes, black has an outside passed pawn. That is the danger zone for black. So black's advantage at this point in time is this pawn. If we look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's the queening square. Black's turn to move. White's king can no longer get into the queening square. Therefore, the only thing that can stop this pawn is the rook. Fine. We have time to get there. We just need to maneuver our rook to get to this pawn. I don't know why I pushed my pawn. My thought process was my opponent's going to slide over. I'm going to slide over. Except then that he can then take and defend, and that's not good. We don't want to see that. So I decided to try something slightly different, defend this way, thinking that the way my opponent has played this game this whole time, been very attacking. So I expected my opponent to attack here, which would give me a free move to slide over. Then my opponent would do, I don't know, probably push, and then I would slide up. Even if they push, I would have time to grab with check and then slide over. So this is kind of going through my mind that that's a possibility. Except my opponent started with the pawn push right away, which threw me off a little bit. So this little remaneuvering thing, I have to be a little bit extra careful of because I got to get to this pawn before it gets down here to the danger zone, right? So I just remaneuver a little bit to give me a chance. Put a rook behind the passed pawn. Whether you are pushing it or whether you are the one being pushed against, put a rook behind the passed pawn. That's the safest way to do it. So that's my goal, is to get a rook behind the passed pawn. Maybe I'll take a pit stop here. Maybe not. My opponent quickly defends. I have an opportunity to push my passed pawn to complicate things. My opponent defends again. So now it's time for me to start sneaking my king over to see if maybe I can get over here in time. My opponent's having nothing of it. All right, that's fine. Now it's time to get my rook over. Our pawns are so far apart that, you know what, let's just trade outside passed pawns, right? He's got an outside passed pawn. I've got a passed pawn. Let's trade those, and then my king will defend my triplets over here. As we're studying the end game, we have to look at what the true strengths are and the true weaknesses are. I give up the pawn. I get my rook behind the passed pawn. My opponent, great move by my opponent, putting me in check. I get my king into the game, and now he's defended. Now, from here, this is the real part. If you're studying endgames, from here, what is white's priority? What is black's priority? I'm out of tea. Black's priority is obviously this passed pawn. Obviously, right? Except the only way this passed pawn can ever promote is if this king gets involved. King's got a long way to go to get there. The king has to get involved. But having my rook behind the passed pawn and my opponent's rook in front of the passed pawn, that means my opponent's rook has to move out of the way, which undefends the pawn. So my rook is stopping this passed pawn completely, 100%. This pawn ain't going nowhere. My opponent's rook is tied up defending the passed pawn because that's his strength. White's job now, and unfortunately I only know this because I am studying endgames after the fact, because I recognized it too late. White's job now is to take triplets and go attack. 3 pawns connected versus a single pawn. One of these is going to get by. My opponent can't hold all 3. Even if I trade off 2 of them for my opponent's 1, I will still have a pawn. So I need to get my king into a position where I'm cutting off my opponent's king, force him to either walk all the way around to try to dislodge my rook, which then I just move. He has to more turns, then I just move. He has more turns. Meanwhile, so White's endgame is focused on these 3 pawns. Black's endgame is that guy, using his single pawn here to try to slow down this. I screwed up. I thought that this dangerous passed pawn was more dangerous than this. I thought that this guy was too close to promoting and I had to get my king over here. Look how close it is to promoting. I panicked. So my king has to come back to the second row, has to. If I stay back here on the third row, right, let's say I make a dumb move. If I stay back here on the third row, this king puts me in check. I have to move out of the way. Queen promotes, protected. Oops, excuse me. Ugh, I can't make my pieces. Promotes, my opponent wins the game. So I know that I have to get back to the second row. I decided to continue forward, attacking this pawn, and at this point in time, my opponent casually slid his rook over. It was at this moment in time I realized that I was tricked. I was focused on this when I should have been focused on this. There's nothing I can do. I am going to lose all of these pawns. I grab, my opponent grabs, with check, I move out of the way. With check, I move out of the way again, he picks up. This, if we turn the analysis on from here, 100% draw. Look at this, draw, 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 draw. There's no advantage anywhere to be had. This is just a draw. I went from a +10 winning to a draw. Oh no, I didn't. At this point in time, I recognize that my triplets are my power. And so, I protected my triplets. Haha, you can't get to my triplets now. You have to waste another move. And now I can get here. And now when you pick up, it doesn't come with check. And now I can defend. No. Nope, 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 nope. Defend my triplets. What does my opponent do from here? He wins the game. Queen. Oh yeah. This is what happened in the game. It's now a rook to no rook. Okay, I still have triplets. I can still maybe hold this. Oops. With check. Picks up the base of the pawn chain. Now, isolated pawns versus a rook. Those are targets. My opponent's king is already here. I resigned. I resigned the game at this point in time. Game over. White resigned. Black is victorious. So this is an end game that I am studying now. Back here on move, what was it, 37? Yeah. So this is an end game I'm studying. For White to recognize, for me to recognize what are the position's strengths and weaknesses. I played this part, these first few moves, I played perfectly. Look at this. I even picked up 2 pawns. Instead of just picking up the 1 pawn and being happy with 1 pawn advantage, I picked up 2 pawns and was able to defend. I finally got myself to a position where I'm 100% still winning. Right here. And if we turn on the engine here, look at this advantage that white has. Keep going. There she goes. Up to a 5+ advantage. Because white has triples versus 1, and this is a decoy that's simply locking up the rooks. This pawn will never promote. It's never a queen. Can't. Black will have to spend so much time trying to get in that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moves to capture that. 1, 2, 3, 4. I could flat out give up that rook and just push this outside passed pawn. My opponent can't even get to pick up this rook before I have a full queen. He moves here, I slide over, and I'm able to defend the rook. That pawn's never promoting. And I didn't recognize that. So now I have to start recognizing these things, that a rook behind the passed pawn is enough. That's enough. And this is the winning advantage. So I went from good, in this particular game, I went from good to bad, to good, to great, to bad, to even, to winning again, to making the dumbest move in chess history. Yeah, right here. Moving away is fine. I just have to move back. Just have to move back is all I have to do. +5 advantage to a -50. And I bet if we let this go on longer to even more depth, it would probably find a forced checkmate. This game is gone. So, oh well, it happens. But we learn from it. So we can learn from the opening, right? This opening was fine. This opening was great. We look at, we got ourselves set up in the Italian game like we want to be, right? For us, as we're learning the game, this is a great setup. My opponent went for some kind of gambit I'm not aware of. That's fine. We develop. Probably got too greedy here. Probably should have just castled at this point in time. I can easily see that my opponent's setting up to castle. Castling is good. I've already got an attack on this pawn. And I am already out and about. So if my opponent were to, challenge and try to defend this pawn, I've got strategy to attack and defend it. Like, I've got plans to get my pawn back. I got a little greedy there. Keep developing. Should have castled, and I didn't. Tried to get tricky. My opponent attacked. We got ourselves a nice tactical analysis just from playing games. We were able to start developing that sixth sense a little to maybe recognize that there's some danger here. So we played the safe moves. Got a little tricksy again, and unfortunately paid the price. Still never developed. Still never castled. Got cramped. So this definitely shows the advantage of castling. Yeah, this game would have been very different. Got cramped, looked for tactics, found a tactic, executed the tactic, able to get ourselves out, set ourselves up beautifully here. Look at this. Look at this beautiful endgame setup for white. White is so happy here, even giving up a pawn for free. We still have 3 connected. We still have a position that we're happy with. Bonehead number 1. And we get to our endgame. We make some good moves here, good moves. And then bonehead number 2, followed by the biggest bonehead of them all, followed by a game loss. Oh well. So this game was a roller coaster, but it has some really teachable moments. That's why I wanted to share it. I hope you guys enjoy this kind of thing. Let me know if you do. Hit the buttons, let me know what you guys think, and we'll talk to you next time. Love you guys.